Alrighty, now we're going to jump ahead from the section about blood and talk a little bit about some of the cardiac physiology that you covered in the cardiovascular system. This is a figure that demonstrates what is happening in the heart during contraction and during relaxation. Let me get a pen here that won't match any of those colors. Okay, excuse me. So we have, in this example, diastole. Diastole means relaxation. And here is systole. My little head over here is covering that up, sorry. So during diastole, this is talking about the relaxation of the heart. And during this phase, the blood is just passively coming into the atria from the superior and the inferior vena cava, and also coming in to the pulmonary veins from the lungs. So when the two atria are relaxed, they are both being filled at the same time from different parts of the body. The vena cava are bringing the blood in from the body, and the pulmonary veins are bringing the blood in from the lungs. So initially, the atria are completely relaxed, and this allows the blood just to flow down through the open AV valves into the ventricles. Now, we have to fill the ventricles all the way before we begin the contraction process. And so usually we get contraction of the atrial walls, so we get some atrial systole just to complete that filling work. About 70% of the ventricular filling happens just through a relaxed atrium, but we need that remaining 30% to get pushed down into the ventricle before we begin the ventricular systole. So we have the filling, and it goes through the open AV valves. Now, the next phase is when we have the contraction begin. And do you remember the conduction system of the heart? Remember we had, let me go ahead and change my color here for you. I'll make it a highlighter. So remember we had the SA node up here. The SA node spreads to the AV node. That fills or signals the atria to contract, right? But then it moves into this interventricular septum. The signal for contraction goes all the way down to the apex, and then from the apex it goes up the walls of the ventricles. The main thing that this does, that I want you to understand, is that by having the contraction actually start down at the bottom, what that ensures, hang on one second. What that ensures is that the contraction actually begins at the bottom of the heart and moves up. Why is that important? Well, if you look at it, the direction where all of this blood needs to go, which is out through the semilunar valves, those openings are all here at the top of the heart. So right here and right here. And so we have to begin the contraction at the apex of the heart, and we do that when that electrical conduction system rushes down to the tip and then spreads back up and then goes through all the myocardium. So as the pressure begins to build here in the ventricles, this blood ends up pushing up against the underside of the AV valves, and that actually causes those valves to close. They have some tethers that are keeping the edges of these valves from actually flapping back open, because that would just push the blood back into the atria. So those tethers, the chordae tendineae, those are keeping the AV valve shut as the blood kind of slams up against the underside of that valve. Now, the blood can't go up into the atrium, so now what it does is that it actually pushes the semilunar valves open. So it's going to have the opposite effect there. And the blood is going to be pushed into the pulmonary trunk from the right ventricle or into the aorta through the left ventricle. Now, as soon as the blood gets pushed up into these big vessels, which is where it needs to be to get pumped out into the body, then the ventricle is going to begin to relax again. And what happens when the ventricle relaxes is that the pressure inside the ventricle drops. So all this blood that's up here in these big chambers, as soon as that ventricle relaxes, what's that blood going to want to do? It's going to fall back down with gravity, and it's going to come back down. But what it does is that it catches the flaps of these semilunar valves and it ends up closing the semilunar valves, and that prevents the blood from flowing backwards into the ventricles. So really, what we're seeing is that the function of all of these valves is really to prevent the backflow of blood. The AV valves prevent the backflow of blood into the atria during ventricular contraction or systole. The semilunar valves prevent the backflow of blood into the ventricles during ventricle relaxation or diastole. And all of these valves ensure that the blood moves from one chamber to the next, to the next, to the next, and everything is going in a unidirectional flow, that we're not going backwards, because that's going to inhibit the function of the cardiovascular system as a whole and prevent our ability to actually deliver oxygenated cells to our tissues the way that we need to. Or we need to deliver oxygen from the cells to all the tissues. I hope that makes sense. So this is the cardiac cycle. We start with the diastole. We talk about the relaxation of atria and ventricles. Then remember we talked about a little phase of atrial systole or contraction that pushes that final bit of blood down into the ventricles. And then the conduction system zooms down to the apex of the heart and the contraction starts at the bottom and squeezes up, which makes sure that all of the blood is getting pumped up into the semilunar valves, and at the same time that forces the closing of the AV valves.